Okay, so here we are again. It's difficult to believe that we have another week off, and so I'm hoping that we can get a lot of work done. I'll be really honest with you, I've now finally, I think I've got everybody on board, that it seems that almost everybody is actually now doing their homework, which is actually a good sign that I'm getting a lot more material than I was in the beginning, when many of you seemed a little bit dozy or assuming that we were having a holiday. And so now you realize that this is serious stuff and that we have a lot of work to do. And Chu Van An definitely expect you to be continuing to learn and to work hard so that you achieve your dreams and your hopes for the final exams. I just want to sort of say that, first of all, that there's been a number of questions that have been sent to me. Keep those questions coming to me, either by email. You know my email address, leo.s@buv.edu.vn, and you can either send it by email or you can send it by Skype. I think I've told you before that my Skype is always on and I will always answer you. And my password is Christopher.Scoggins, so it's small CHRISTOPHER.SCOGGINS. So if you put that in, I will know that you have connected to the Skype, and then don't be shy, just relax, sit on a sofa and talk to me about some of the problems or some of the issues that you don't understand or you want me to go over. In fact, there's been a couple of you who have already said that you have watched the video and you did read the handout, but still it wasn't really 100% clear. So you wanted to know how, could we go over this one more time, or and I think that certainly if I find that the same questions or the same area are confusing, then I'd be happy on the video to go over it again. What I think that you need to do is you need to be really well organized. Okay, this is a trying time for everybody in Vietnam. It's not only for you, but also for teachers and for the university here. And clearly, we need to get ourselves well organized and make sure that things are handed in on time. What I actually think now is that I'm going to be sending out these videos, and I want the answers to these videos by the Thursday. So if I put it out on Monday, you send me the answers by Thursday, and I can actually mark them or assess your work, and then I will send by the Friday, I will send the results of who has actually done their work and who has done it at a standard which I would consider to be acceptable. So your coordinator, your grade 10 coordinator, would actually have the names of people who are participating and those who are not participating. So first of all, I just want to go over some of the questions that have been asked. Question number one: are there problems when the government decides to control the exchange rate? That was one of the questions. Pretty good question, to be honest. I think there are problems. I mean, I'm generally speaking sympathetic to the idea of government intervening in the economy. I feel as a Keynesian that there's a lot to be said for making sure that when there is a market failure, that when the exchange rate is becoming unstable, that there's probably a reason for it, and therefore the government needs to step in. Okay, now I think I said to you before that, when there is a war, when there was World War II, Winston Churchill in Great Britain, he definitely had a fixed exchange rate. In fact, it was almost impossible during the war to, excuse me, to buy or sell foreign exchange. And certainly during the American war here in Vietnam, again, there was somewhat of a fixed exchange rate, and the government was clearly intervening to stabilize the economy, because certainly the economy was one of the aspects of warfare by the Americans against the Vietnamese people, was the whole process of trying to destabilize Vietnam's economy so that the Vietnamese people will be on their knees and they will be begging forgiveness to the American military. And of course, due to Ho Chi Minh and to the Vietnamese people, that never happened, thank goodness. And for that reason, we have independent sovereignty and a successful economy, which is getting about 6% economic growth at the moment. So to answer the question, are there problems when the government decides to control the exchange rate? Yes, there are. Okay, the biggest problem is that usually the exchange rate is artificially marked higher than the true value. This is normally the case, with probably the exception of Japan, because Japan has often tried to lower their exchange rate because they feel that the Japanese yen is overvalued, and because it is overvalued, it makes anybody buying a Japanese product to be really, really expensive. And Japan, being an export-driven economy, needs to have a competitive exchange rate. Now, for other countries, it's not like that. Most countries, including Canada, would prefer to have probably an appreciation of their currency, and therefore if they did actually try to control it, they would try to control it so that the value was actually higher than the equilibrium point at the free market. So what this means is that almost automatically you will see a black market. Okay, the moment that happens, then suddenly a lot of investors don't want to have anything to do with your economy. Suddenly as a business person in Vietnam, you're dealing with different exchange rates and you're not too sure how that's going to work. The exchange rate may be better by the government, but then the government will make rules and regulations about who can receive that prime exchange rate and who will receive a less favorable exchange rate. So the whole thing is a bit of a mess. And I don't think it's desirable to somehow artificially create a black market. Given that, we have to accept that there are times in the history of different countries that there is huge instability, and that might be due to crop failure because it doesn't rain, or it's too much rain, or maybe there's exogenous reasons, like the oil is not delivered because there's a Middle East conflict, and therefore the economy is in crisis, and there's a devaluation in the currency. It might be for reasons of a trading war, such as between the Chinese and the Americans at the moment, which is really nothing to do with the average individual business person. And so for that reason, it's recommended that the government step in and do something to protect investment and workers, to make sure that their currency is not out of control. Given that, there is a risk. The risk is that the currency will not be highly valued. It will be almost impossible to leave the country with local currency and try to change that local currency into other currencies. Like if you went to Thailand with Vietnam Dong, they might decide to refuse to accept that currency, and you don't want that to happen, because it creates problems in international trade. Suddenly, for the imported products that we need, and you look around your room, you'll see probably the majority of the stuff in your room is actually imported. All of that is going to have to be paid by foreign currency if the value of the currency is not seen as a genuine, true value of that currency. If somebody, probably in the United States, like the World Bank or the IMF, if they somehow believe that there's been a bit of currency manipulation going on, they can just decide, okay, well, the local currency is not of value, and therefore they will demand that all payments be made in something like the US dollar or something else, or the euro perhaps, or some other currency that is viewed as a hard currency. So I would say that it is an essential tool in the toolbox, you might say, for governments to, in emergency situations, to somehow fix the exchange rate. Sometimes when the exchange rate is crashing, maybe for psychological reasons, people suddenly get all crazy and they say, oh, I got to get out of this currency. What they do is they actually pull out the plug. They pull out the plug of the international exchange sort of market, and for about half an hour they tell everybody to calm down, because a lot of the decision making is done on emotion rather than on concrete statistics or information. And so again, that is a way that governments try to somehow control the exchange rate. So hopefully that helps answer the question. Question number 2, I was given by one of you. One of you said that, why does the central bank influence the exchange rate? Well, I mean, in many ways, the central bank does not actually set the exchange rate, but they create the conditions, either through setting the interest rates or other things like the reserve ratio or the discount rate. These things will affect the exchange rate. And don't forget, the central bank, the governor of the central bank, which in the United States is called the Federal Reserve, but here in Vietnam and in Canada, we call it the central bank. And the big boss of the central bank is called the governor of the central bank. In fact, John Maynard Keynes, in the 1930s, when he wrote his book, The General Theory, he was also the governor of the Bank of England. So these people usually are kind of clever people, and also they're friends of the government. Okay, the government normally has a buddy sitting in the chair of the governor of the central bank. Now I know that has been changed a little bit. For example, in the United States, the head of the Reserve Bank in the United States has been the same chairman between different governments. But usually, outside a few cases, they tend to be allies of the government. And when a new government with a new policy steps in, they want a new governor of the central bank. So they kick out the old guy and they bring in their guy. And that guy or that woman probably has a PhD in economics and has experience in these type of things. And you will find that the central bank will make decisions in order to make the exchange rate a little bit more stable, or we would say more predictable, so that investments and business people can somehow predict as to whether they're going to make a profit or not after the production cycle. So if you're investing, if you're considering investing, people don't invest because they like your face. They invest because they want to make a profit. And they're not going to make a profit, or they don't know whether they're going to make a profit if they think that the exchange rate is everywhere, particularly if the product is being exported or the inputs are being imported. This is actually kind of important. So to answer your question, The central bank doesn't actually set the exchange rate, but they set the conditions, and they kind of recommend an exchange rate or an exchange rate policy which will somehow bring the exchange rate to a certain number that is considered acceptable to most people. Now in Canada, you know, we've had a problem. I mean, the last 5-6 years, there has been a devaluation in the currency from about par to the US dollar to about, I think it's about 68 cents today. And some people, like exporters, they think this is really great, you know, because they feel that they get more sales when the Canadian dollar is really cheap. But a lot of other people, like Canadians who want to go on holiday, they feel very insulted when they suddenly realize that their Canadian dollar doesn't go very far when they go overseas. Question number 3, what should the government do if the domestic currency starts to quickly devalue? Well, I've answered that question a little bit already, but basically you need to see it a bit like an emergency, like if it's crashing, particularly for no obvious or valid reason, then probably you need to hope that somebody pulls the plug so that people calm down and start thinking about the essential statistics and whether it merits a further devaluation in your currency. Now this could be a question of survival for your economy, because obviously if you devalue the currency, that sounds good for, you know, a few exporters, but if it keeps devaluing, eventually you could devalue to almost nothing. And suddenly, you know, your money is worth junk. We call that junk. And so for that reason, you've got to be really, really careful when you allow a currency to devalue. You've probably already heard the term of the J curve. This is something that you're going to learn next year particularly, but the J curve is another example of where a lot of people are very happy to allow the currency to devalue, hoping that this will somehow stimulate the economy and promote exports, etc., etc. But due to the time lag between, you know, when people hear about this devaluation in the currency and when they start buying more of your products because they're so cheap, this could be a very long period, and it could actually mean that the economy goes down rather than going up. So there's a danger involved with there. So to answer your question, you know, what should the government do? Well, they could, in certain circumstances, actually enter into the international currency market and start buying their own currency. Okay, and of course that is a very expensive strategy. I think I would not recommend it, certainly not very often, maybe only in emergency situations where you really feel that your currency could slide out of control. And so to make sure that there are not just sellers but there's also buyers, the government sort of steps in to buy the local currency. And by doing so, you could temporarily slow down the slide. But in my opinion, you're going to find that the slide will probably, you know, go back to the old slide pretty quickly. And you have spent maybe billions of dollars in foreign currency that you could have spent to, you know, build hospitals or roads or schools or whatever public expenditure, in order for a slight delay in a devaluation of the currency. So you have to be pretty sure, and I don't think you could be really, really sure, but you have to try to be pretty sure that when you do this, that it will have some form of long-term impact and not just throwing hard currency down the drain. Because of course the supply of foreign currency that the central government has is usually very limited. It is scarce. It's usually only received by the government when, you know, public enterprises, maybe like an airline or maybe rice exporters, that they are receiving hard currency, and this hard currency is taken by the government and, given, passed on in local currency to the suppliers, the local suppliers, and this sort of provides for a fair amount of hard currency held by the central bank. And if the central bank decides to spend all of the money that they have raised over the last year in one splash of buying their own currency, then they're going to be in real trouble. So it's like trying to do something about, a volatile, supply and demand curve. The only thing that really can work in the long run is to get the fundamentals right. And that means that, you need to start exporting more and importing less, which might mean that you need to introduce tariffs in order to discourage too much imports, or you need to do something to help those who are trying to export their products, including tourism, to succeed so that they actually make more money and they can pass that on to the exchange rate that will be eventually translated in a revaluation of the exchange rate. So as I say, in the long run, it's a supply and demand question. And the government has to realize that they can suddenly, in a short-term situation, they can try to fool the international currency markets by throwing a lot of hard currency at the international markets to try to boost the value of the local currency. But in the long run, it's not going to work. So the fundamentals of, making sure that there are greater exports and fewer imports are probably what will solve the problem. And finally, before we haven't even got on to our class today, but we've had a lot of questions, and I'm very keen to answer any questions that you send me. You say that it is bad for a government to borrow from the IMF. Why is that? Well, that's a good question. That's a very good question. The IMF have had a very checkered past. They're based in Washington. It's called the International Monetary Fund. The logic of the International Monetary Fund is to help countries who are suffering from debt crisis, where they clearly are unable perhaps to pay their debts, and therefore they need somebody to step in and try to save the day. It is by itself, it is a sign of failure, in my opinion, of the economy and maybe the Minister of Finance and maybe the government as well, if the government regularly has to go to the IMF to try to help them bail you out. So what it usually means is that the IMF, and they'll do this, by the way, not only for so-called less developed countries, but also for developed countries. I remember in the 1970s that Great Britain suddenly went into huge debt during the Callaghan government in the late 1970s, and the IMF were called to sort of lend Great Britain money so that the British pound would not crash. This is also the case in many less developed countries where they think that this is an easy solution. Oh, no problem, we'll just pick up a telephone and call the IMF and they will bail us out. Well, they're not quite as generous as that. It's a bit like when you borrow $10 from your brother, and then your brother wants you to shine his shoes for the next period until you pay him back. Because, he's not your mother, he doesn't love you that desperately, and the IMF definitely don't love you that much. They want you to pay them back. This is not a donation, and they will do everything necessary to rearrange or reorganize your economy to make sure that you pay them back. And that means that they will actually, enter into your Ministry of Finance. They will send a team of specialists who will come in and they will reorganize your economy. And what that usually means is that they will start to privatize your economy. They'll say, well, you can't really afford to have a national airline which is publicly owned, or you can't really afford all these free hospitals or free medicines, or you shouldn't have these public schools that are for everybody. You need to make sure that all the schools can pay their own way. And they'll also say, well, subsidies are very expensive, and therefore you may have introduced a subsidy on rice to make sure that you don't actually suffer, or the poor or the lower income people don't suffer from hunger. And so you want to make sure that everybody can afford to buy rice. Well, suddenly the IMF aren't that concerned about whether everybody can consume rice. They're interested in getting your economy in a more profit-driven manner, and therefore a lot of the consequences of their policies will be to reorganize your economy in a much more business-friendly, capitalist-oriented manner, so that you can pay them back. And there have been many accusations in the past where it is believed that certain governments, they want other governments to get themselves into debt so that they can reorganize their economy. They believe so strongly in the private sector and the capitalist system that they think that getting countries heavily in debt, making them beg for money from the IMF, and then the IMF suddenly arrives by helicopter into your capital city and your Ministry of Finance, and before you know it, you've lost almost all your independence and sovereignty and everything. And so I don't know how Ho Chi Minh would feel about that, that a whole generation of people, or many generations, died for the freedom of the Vietnamese people, and suddenly within a generation, suddenly Vietnam is being held together by a foreign institution and basically supported by a foreign power to reorganize their economy, to make it more Western friendly, you might say, or business friendly, or more capitalist, or whatever. How you want to describe it. The bottom line is that most countries will never regain that independence or sovereignty that they had before they called in the IMF. Okay, so that's questions for this week. Please keep sending them on. I'm very happy to answer them either on the video, or I can answer them privately with you on Skype or on the email, whatever. Okay, so I don't want to spend too long on this video. You'll probably fall asleep if I keep going for a couple of hours or something. So I want you to pull out the handout that I gave you, I sent to you through Google Classroom. This week it is on trading blocks, and you received it yesterday, and in there it basically goes over the whole issue of what a trading block is and what are some of the benefits and the problems of a trading block. So just to go over it, starts off with the definition that a trading bloc is a group of countries that have signed an agreement to reduce or eliminate tariffs, quotas, and other protectionist barriers between themselves. Okay, so it means that they're kind of bringing many countries together. Okay, and for that reason, some people, not myself I would say, but many people somehow believe that this will make everything a lot better, because it will promote greater specialization in every country, and that you will trade a lot more, and that you will become more prosperous, and that you will become more integrated. You will become less parochial. Parochial means that you're kind of only interested in local issues. They want you to become much more globalist. They want you to believe in sort of maybe the brotherhood of your area. So, for example, the the ASEAN countries, countries like Thailand and Vietnam and Singapore and South Korea and Indonesia, all these countries are all kind of organized together to promote greater trade, specialization, and economic development. Now, is that a good thing? Well, sometimes, some people would argue, many of the benefits, it might bring down prices, greater competition, all that, more choice for consumers. Consumers just love choice, don't they? But clearly there's also disadvantages as well. So if you can look on your paper, the second paragraph, it talks a little bit about the advantages, basically related to lower prices, increased export potential, higher growth, economies of scale, and greater competition. Okay, and the problems, if you turn the page, are in that list. Some regional trade agreements in practice distribute the gains from trade unequally. And a common criticism is that less developed countries benefit very little from the trading blocs, but at the same time force the less developed country to open up their markets to foreign producers. And this is really even the argument that came down about international trade and, the law of comparative advantage and all those issues, where it was suggested that a lot of less developed countries don't actually benefit that much from international trade. That they open up their economy thinking, oh, no problem, I can now start exporting to all the countries. Well, a lot of countries may not want your products because they may feel that your product is not the best in the world. So what you have essentially done is you have opened up your own market without getting too many benefits because nobody wants your product, that your product is not competitive either in terms of price or quality. And so a lot of people could be really upset about that, and they're going to say, well, hang on a minute, we've given up everything to be able to compete on an international stage, and nobody wants to buy our products, but everybody wants to sell their products in our supermarkets. And so suddenly you go to the supermarket and everything is actually imported. Okay, I mean, even something like wine, you may find that you may produce wine really well, and but people want French or Italian or Portuguese wine because they think it's, on the TV it says that they're more delicious or they're better or they're higher quality or something like that. And before you know it, and I know this to be true because I lived in Zimbabwe for 5 years, that produces fantastic Zimbabwean wine, but nobody seemed to want to buy it. Everybody wanted to buy the imported stuff, and before you know it, this type of opening up, trading blocks and free trade basically, was a dagger in the economy of Zimbabwe. So I think Zimbabwe has regretted doing that, and they have pulled back from a lot of their trading agreements, and they no longer belong to all the trading blocks that they used to belong to. Then the number 2 was the creation of trading blocks can lead to more what they call trade diversion than trade creation. You should know those terms already. Look it up in your book if you're not too sure what they mean. They therefore reduce overall economic output even if some members of the trading bloc are net gainers. Many members of the trading bloc are concerned that their national sovereignty can be threatened by this forced free trade. Countries worry that they may lose their freedom and independence to govern their own country. Okay, so this, it depends on how developed the trading bloc is as well. Okay, now the EU is probably the most advanced of all the trading blocs because they have one currency, the euro, and it also means that labor is free to move anywhere within the EU. So it means, up until the 1st of January or the 30th of January, when Great Britain used to belong to the EU. They're now out. But before then, anybody with a passport from one of the, I think it's 27 EU countries, could decide to go and work in Britain if you wanted to. If you wanted to buy a car in Italy because you felt that the car was cheaper in Italy than it was in Great Britain, you could do that without any problem at all. And a lot of people don't like it. I mean, you have to say to yourself, if we had a developed trading bloc in the ASEAN countries, similar to the EU, which meant that everybody from Singapore could decide to move to Vietnam, would that be a good idea? I mean, for me, it doesn't bother me because, I'm happy with anybody, but a lot of Vietnamese patriots or nationalists may feel, all these foreigners coming into my country, I don't like that. Or would it be a good idea to allow the Vietnam Dong to disappear? Is that a good idea? And then suddenly we're going to have, a new currency, maybe called the ASEAN currency, and and all the ASEAN countries will communicate and to trade using the ASEAN currency. Would that be a good idea? Well, I can almost hear your screams of anguish through the camera that you probably don't like that. A lot of people didn't like it. And it's one of the reasons why Great Britain never accepted the euro as their currency. I mean, the British are kind of an arrogant lot anyway, so it is fairly predictable that they didn't want to lose their British pound. They felt that they've had their British pound for the last 1,000 years or 500 years, I suppose. Why would they give up their pound today? And I think there was a couple of countries like Denmark as well. I think Denmark did not give up their currency. A lot of other countries, they didn't seem to care. Italy and Austria and Germany and France, they were quite happy. The Netherlands and Belgium, they were quite happy to have a European currency, and there was never really a problem. But some countries, maybe for historical or cultural reasons, they were kind of upset with that. And so that never really passed. So what we're saying here is that, I don't know if it's a disadvantage, but some people would say it is a disadvantage, that when you have a trading bloc, you're going to lose your sovereignty and independence, and you're going to have to rely on people who are not really from your country. And some of you may lose a bit of sleep about that. I don't know. So you got two questions here. I don't think that they're very difficult, okay? What is the role played by trading blocs such as ASEAN, NAFTA, and the EU in the promotion of international trade? That sounds like a really good question. It was a question in a past exam paper, so that's why I took it out of there. The NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement. That is between the Canadians, the Americans, and the Mexicans. And it's changed a little bit in the last 6 months. I think there's a new name for NAFTA because Donald Trump decided that he wanted a new law that would be a bit different. But basically, it's supposed to be a free trade zone between Canada, United States, and Mexico, and finally the EU, the European Union. So what is the role played by these trading blocs with the objective of promoting international trade? Do they really promote international trade? Do you think that if we didn't have these trading blocs, that international trade would be less? I don't know. You tell me, okay? So answer that question. And then finally, there is a list of 6 different trading blocs: the preferential trading area, the free trade area, the customs union, the common markets, the economic unions, and the monetary unions, okay? Now, lucky for you, it's in the textbook, okay? And therefore, this is not a very difficult question. But what I'm asking you to do is to give 2 characteristics of each of the following examples. In other words, tell me what a free trade area is. Like, why is it different from any other, name like an economic union? Why is a free trade area not the same as a monetary union? Okay, so 2 characteristics of each one of those 6. Okay, and that's about it for today. And so hopefully you will have more questions. You will do your homework by this Thursday, I'll say by 12 o'clock. Okay, 12 o'clock, 12 noon, we'll make it 12 noon so that I can read all of your answers by Thursday afternoon, and that I can get out the results by Friday. I come here in BV every day, okay? I'm here 7 days a week, Saturdays and Sundays included, to try to help you, to try to prepare, to try to make sure that the handouts are relevant and useful for you. So I want you, I expect you to work as hard as I do, okay? And that means answering the homework questions. So good luck until next time, stay safe, and I wish you a happy Monday. Bye-bye.